Welcome back to Crime of Slaves, where we dig up the darkest family secrets that lie just beneath the surface of the most ordinary lives. It was a damp November evening when my mother whispered those words to me. "Never ask about your father's sister. She died in 1987, and from that instant, something about our family felt permanently changed, as though a shadow had fallen across everything I thought I knew." This is the tale of the Eldridge family, a name once spoken with admiration in the small New England town of Ashbury Hollow, but now uttered in hushed tones and sideways glances, as if saying it might summon something best left forgotten. If you have ever wondered how a single phrase can open a door to a maze of secrets, then stay with me, because what lies ahead is far from ordinary. Before we cross the threshold, if you have a taste for unraveling mysteries that send chills down your spine, consider subscribing. It helps keep the light burning in this dark place. The Eldridge estate sat at the center of Ashbury Hollow, perched on a knoll where ancient oaks cast long shadows over cobblestone paths and overgrown gardens. The house was a sprawling Victorian relic. Its weathered gray shingles had bowed under countless winters, while the wraparound porch sagged like the tired shoulders of an old servant weary from too much waiting. Evening fog clung to the windows like a veil hiding the past. I knew the house well. I had lived within its creaking walls since childhood, but there was a room upstairs I was forbidden to enter. I always respected that unwritten rule. The house smelled of damp wood, fading wallpaper, and the faintest hint of something floral and sickly sweet, like withered roses pressed between the pages of a forgotten book. At night, the settling groans of the timber often felt less natural than the wind-stirring shadows that looked an awful lot like watching eyes. My mother, Evelyn, was a woman who wore regret beneath her calm. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, her eyes often glimmering in the lamplight with a mixture of pride and restraint. She rarely spoke of the past, except for warnings and fragments. The man I knew as my father, Jonathan Eldridge, was tall and solemn, his sharp cheekbones casting deep shadows beneath heavy brows. His silence was encyclopedic, especially whenever I wandered too close to the subject of his family. The Eldridges had been pillars of the community since the late 1800s, founding Ashbury Hollow's only mill and holding a kind of quiet authority over the lives that depended on its machinery. But behind that respectability was a past riddled with tragedies. The kind townsfolk swallowed up with their morning coffee and refused to discuss at the grocery store or church. Diaries recovered decades later mentioned a certain Hester Eldridge, my father's sister, who had died under mysterious circumstances in 1987. But every official record was oddly incomplete. Her birth certificate, marriage records, even the death certificate were mysteriously missing or redacted. What no one knew at the time was how deeply entwined that loss was with a darkness that still reverberated beneath the peeling wallpaper of the Eldridge household. I was 17 when the quiet of Ashbury Hollow was ruptured by a single phone call. My mother's fingers trembled as she held the receiver, her voice dropping into a whisper that cut through the fog outside my window. The voice I heard, low and urgent, said little, but their few words set the gears in motion. It was the kind of call you only receive when the past has clawed its way back to demand attention. Not long after, I found myself standing in my father's study. The air was thick with the scent of old leather, bound books and tobacco smoke long since vanished. His desk was a chaotic mess of letters, faded photographs, and newspaper clippings. But what caught my attention was an envelope, yellowed and fragile, addressed simply to me in my mother's exact handwriting. Inside was a black and white photo of a woman I had never seen before, her eyes wide and unblinking, her dress anachronistically old-fashioned. On the back was scrolled a single line, the ink dark and smudged. "Never ask about your father's sister." It was a warning written with fear. That night I lay awake, the house creaking around me like an old beast. And the image of that woman's face haunted my mind. Who was she? Why had she been erased from the family's story? And what secret had made my mother's voice so urgent? The Eldridge mansion was a microcosm of Ashbury Hollow itself, its grandeur hiding rot beneath. The town was encircled by dense forests where the mist hung low like spirits unwilling to be disturbed. And the locals moved with an unspoken understanding that some memories were better left buried. The streets were lined with clapboard houses, all weathered by biting winds that carried whispers. The years of industrial boom and decline had left the hollow skeletal and silent by night. Only the Eldridge estate stood stubborn and defiant in its bygone majesty. It was here my curiosity began to clash with the ironclad barricades of family silence. I began retracing my footsteps into the family archive stored in the attic. A cramped, dim space choked with dust, moth-eaten drapery, and trunks brimming with yellowing letters and brittle photographs. Each artifact felt like a fragment of a broken mirror, reflecting shards of a story I was unprepared to face. I unearthed birth announcements, crumbling wedding invitations, and in a sealed box, a diary belonging to the woman in the photograph, my father's sister, Hester. Its leather cover was cracked, and I opened it with reluctance, revealing curly handwriting that trembled like a candle flame caught in a draft. The entry stopped abruptly in late autumn of 1987. One passage chilled me more than the rest. She wrote, "There are things in this house I cannot speak aloud. Shadows gather in the corners of my vision and whisper my name. The family listens but does not hear. I fear what my absence might unleash. But why? And what had she seen?" These questions scratched at my mind, but every attempt to ask my mother about Hester was met with a taut silence, averting eyes that said, "Stop right there." It seemed as if asking about my aunt unraveled not only the fabric of family history, but also the fragile peace we all lived within. The house groaned beneath the weight of unspoken horrors. Outside, the bare branches tapped against the windows, sounding like ghostly fingers trying to enter, reminding me this was no longer just a house. It was a vault sealed with dread. The first sign of true wrongness came late one night, when I heard a soft knock on the attic door. No one else was awake. The knock came again, a single deliberate rap, followed by a faint female sobbing that seemed to curl around the rafters. Heart pounding, I crept to the door, feeling the chill press against my skin like a warning. But when I opened it, the attic was empty except for the diary and swirling motes of dust caught in the silver moonlight. Something was restless. Something wanted me to know. I began to ask discreet questions of the town's folk. The librarian, Mrs. Cartwright, a brittle woman with eyes sharp as flint, spoke reluctantly of the Eldridge family. She mentioned the tragedy in 1987, how Hester had vanished one bitter December night, found dead days later in the frozen woods beyond the estate. There were rumors, whispers really, of mental illness, of ghosts haunting the hallways. Yet, the official story was a quiet death from exposure, swiftly hushed to protect the family's reputation. But when I asked about the death certificate, a crucial piece of paperwork missing from the town archives, she lowered her gaze and said simply, "Records are sometimes altered to preserve peace." The town had colluded in the silence. It was a pact to forget, a shadow pact that extended from the covenants signed in the 18th century to the present day. The deeper I dug, the more it became clear that Ashbury Hollow prospered. Because the Eldridges prospered, and that prosperity was built on the bones of secrets. My evenings were now filled with restless dreams, dark corridors twisting beyond recognition, voices calling my name from rooms long sealed, faces in the mist that dissolved when approached. The mansion seemed alive with breath and murmurs, the walls sighing with the weight of unspoken guilt. Even the family portraits hanging in the hallway took on an eerie quality in the flickering candlelight. The eyes of my great-grandfather, stern and accusing, my grandmother, her smile tight like a riddle, and a small portrait of Hester peering from the shadows, her gaze unsettlingly direct. On one particularly stormy night, the house seemed to shudder under the assault of thunder and wind. It was a moment when I found myself inexplicably drawn to the locked room on the second floor, the one my mother warned me never to enter. Its door was an old oak slab, weathered and scarred, locked with an ancient iron key that had long vanished. Around that door was a faint outline, as if it had not always been there, a seam in the plaster, too perfect to be accidental. I pressed my palm against the cold wood, feeling a thrum beneath, like a heartbeat trapped in the walls. The house held its breath, and I knew some part of Hester still lingered there, waiting for the truth to be found. Days later, a package arrived at the front door, unmarked and anonymous. Inside was a letter in shaky handwriting that read, "You were not meant to uncover this. Some doors close only to hide horrors deeper than death. Remember her name and beware the silence." No return address, no signature, just the slow curling of the paper fading by degrees as if afraid to be seen. Who had sent it? What warning did it contain? My mother's face looked older now, shadows gathering under her eyes, as if the memory of Hester was a wound that would never heal. In the kitchen that night, she finally spoke in a voice cracked with years of suppression. She said she was never meant to be spoken of again. Some sins do not wash away with time. That phrase echoed as I lay awake, the storm rattling the window panes like a warning from the past. The mystery was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever walked the halls of the Eldridge estate, to every neighbor who had smiled politely but looked away, to the silent house that watched and waited in the dark. The question burned in me. What had happened to Hester? And why had my own family tried so hard to erase her? What was so terrible that even the living were afraid of her shadow? And then, just as the night was thickening around me, I heard it. A low whisper sliding down the staircase. A voice unmistakably female, murmuring my name, soft, insistent, and unmistakably there. I rose, heart hammering, but the corridor lay empty, cold as the grave. The house held its breath, and behind the locked door, something stirred. The whispered name lingered in the cold air like a curse, a finger tracing the outline of a wound my family had tried to conceal. It was in that breathless moment, standing before the locked door, that the house seemed to swell around me with secretive anticipation. The ancient oak door, dark and knotted, resisted every attempt to coax a story from it. Yet, I could almost hear the faint scrape of desperate nails against splintered wood, the presence of something trapped and unheard. The next day, I returned to the town, with a restless determination I had never known before. If my family would not speak, then others must hold some shard of the truth. My first stop was the Ashbury Hollow Historical Society, a place where time seemed to have settled like thick dust on every ledger and photograph. The curator, a man named Edmund Ferris, was a gaunt figure with rheumy eyes behind thick spectacles, his voice as dry as the parchment he tended. When I mentioned Hester Eldridge, his face tightened, a flicker of something unspoken crossing his features. He admitted that official documents showed little beyond a notation of her disappearance, but then carefully slid across a brittle newspaper clipping dated December 19, 1987. The headline was stark: "Missing Eldridge daughter found dead in snow." The article itself was cursory, hinting at a tragic accident, but glossing over details, emphasizing the family's grief and urging respect for their privacy. Edmund leaned closer and whispered, "Not everything was published, of course. The town protects its own, for better or worse." I pressed for more, and he mentioned one Magdalene Crowley, an elderly woman who had lived in Ashbury longer than anyone else still walking its streets, known to be eccentric, perhaps mad. Some said Magdalene was said to have been a friend, if you could call it that, of Hester's. Turning to her might yield truths no one else dared voice. Finding Magdalene's cottage was like stepping into a pocket of the past frozen in amber. Ivy strangled the weather-beaten clapboards, and the windows, dusty and cracked, seemed to peer outward like wary eyes. When I knocked, the door creaked open to reveal a small room cluttered with glass jars, dried herbs, and fading photographs pinned haphazardly to creaking walls. Magdalene looked up with startling clarity, pale skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, hair a tangled silver crown. When I said Hester, her eyes darkened, and for the first time I saw something raw fear mixed with sorrow. She said, "She was more than just a sister to that house, and more than a girl with a shadowy past. You must understand that the Eldridge family wears their secrets like a shroud, and some things have teeth." Magdalene shared stories that had never crossed my mother's lips. Whispered legends of the estate's foundations laid in the blood and bone of the forgotten. She spoke of a curse tied to a bloodline fracture, of Hester's desperate attempts to undo what was broken before it consumed more than just her. According to Magdalene, Hester had been marked, cursed in a way that blurred the lines between madness and something mournful and unnatural. She told me that in the cold months before her disappearance, Hester had been seen wandering the woods behind the estate, talking to shadows nobody else could perceive. I asked how Magdalene had come to hold such knowledge, and she revealed that her own mother had been the Eldridge family's housekeeper for nearly 50 years, a silent witness to the house's slow descent into darkness. But it was the story of the Wendigo, a creature of myth and legend, forever starving, associated with the cursed and the lost, that unsettled me most. Magdalene insisted the family, long feared an ancestor, had bargained with this ancient hunger, that the curse was a seed sown through generations, growing silently until it found Hester as its willing vessel. What Magdalene said next sent a shiver down my spine. Hester did not die from exposure. She was never found in the woods at all. The body in the snow had been a ruse. What happened was worse. No one wanted to name it, but the curse had claimed her. That night, back at the mansion, the fog seemed to seep through the cracks again with newfound weight. The walls whispered between themselves, and the portraits on the walls looked down with growing malice. I pored over Magdalene's few written recollections, fragments of letters she had kept, notes smelling of damp ink and despair. One letter preserved with care bore my mother's name alongside a warning I had not yet seen. I read, "You must protect him. The curse is not just history. It reaches forward like claws hungry for the living." Then came a knock at the door in the dead of night. Unlike before, sharp, impatient, as if time itself was demanding entry. When I opened it, no one was there, save for a single rose petal, blackened with age, but fragrant with decay. In the following days, curiosity pushed me to seek out my father's oldest friends, though their caution was palpable. One man, Samuel Hargrove, who had worked alongside my father in the mill and had shared a tentative friendship in youth, finally agreed to meet. His small kitchen was dim, filled with the sour smell of brewing tea and old wood smoke. His voice trembled as he told me about Hester, but quickly became tethered to silence. He said something strange. After her disappearance, The whole town seemed to draw a veil over the Eldridge mansion, as if the air itself resisted crossing the threshold. People spoke of eerie lights flickering in the windows, shadowy figures roaming the grounds, and the occasional cry that pierced the night. Samuel's gaze dropped to his cold cup, and he said quietly, "Something about Hester was never quite right. She had been a tempest trapped in a gilded cage, but no one could say what demons tore at her soul." Then he asked, "Did you know before it all the town suffered years of failed harvests and a sickness that swept quietly through families? It was whispered the Eldridge's prosperity came at a price, a dark bargain sealed generations ago. But the worst part," he lowered his voice further, "was the night Hester vanished. Some people in the town swear they saw her walking into the woods, but others claim she was pulled back into the house by unseen hands, screaming until the walls absorbed her voice forever." After Samuel's confession, I was left unsettled, but it made me realize that the story stretched far beyond a single missing girl. The curse was woven tightly into Ashbury Hollow's history, binding the fates of the townsfolk and the Eldridge family in a chilling grip. Days turned into weeks, and the diary's silence grew louder. Then I found a second hidden volume, tucked away beneath a loose floorboard in the attic. This diary was different, older, blurred with water stains and red-rimmed pages. It belonged to my great-grandmother, Margaret Eldridge, a woman little remembered, but whose words revealed whispers of the family's name being tainted by something unnatural. There, between brittle lines, she wrote of a pact made in the late 1800s, an unspoken agreement to sacrifice one soul vowed to protect the rest. The sacrifice was a daughter, a child born with a mark upon her that the family called the blood of the Wendigo. Margaret's entries hinted at Hester being this child, the sealed chapter in a tale of greed and desperation. The family's fortune, she confessed, was built upon a bloodline tainted by darkness, and every generation since had been watched, their lives shadowed by a hunger no human spirit could fully quell. I sat in the attic with the sun setting behind the rotting oaks, the diary heavy in my hands. A sense of suffocation grew, the sensation that each breath drew me deeper into a web too tangled to escape. That night, as the wind howled through fractured window panes, I dreamed of a woman with wild eyes, standing at the edge of a frozen forest, her voice echoing a plea for release or a warning to stay away. When I awoke, a chill pressed against my chest, and the key to the locked room glinted on the floor beside my bed, though I had nowhere found it in the house before. I gripped it, heart slamming. What they hid in that room was no ordinary secret. It was a wound in the family's soul that could not heal. My next visit was to the church, an iron-root sanctuary where countless Eldridge funerals had unfolded under stained glass eyes that seemed to judge without mercy. The minister, Reverend Holloway, was a man who had lived in Ashbury Hollow nearly all his life. He was hesitant at first, but after an hour of conversation and the mention of Hester's name, his calm broke. He confessed that Hester's death had not been natural, nor had it been an accident. The church records noted a funeral in absentia, a service for a lost soul never truly laid to rest. What most did not know was that Hester's body had never been found in the snow, and no one witnessed her funeral, except the most devout family members, who spoke of rites and prayers, whispered behind locked doors, and suppressed screams. According to Reverend Holloway, Hester was believed to have been consumed by the family's darkest secret, a manifestation of the curse that was carried within the blood and soil. He said the Eldridges conducted ceremonies, but not for peace, for containment. The house itself was an altar, and Hester, the unwilling sacrifice. The truth, as it turned out, was far worse than anyone imagined. No one dared break the silence, not because of shame alone, but because to speak her name openly risked awakening what slumbered beneath the Eldridge estate, a malevolent echo of old bargains made in desperation. The sense of dread grew unbearably thick, pressing on me with the weight of inherited guilt I could neither understand nor relinquish. Yet, the deeper I probed, the more the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred. The family was trapped in a cycle of horror as much as it was the source of it. As I pieced together testimonies, letters, and fragmented memories, an unshakable image took hold. A woman not broken by madness, but by something unseen, a spiritual contagion that consumed her from within. One late afternoon, in the muted light of the town's library, I discovered another fragment, an official coroner's dispatch from 1987 stored in a forgotten volume, heavily redacted and obscured under layers of government seals. What it revealed was a diagnosis that chilled my blood. Cause of death listed as hypothermia, complicated by acute psychosis. But the narrative hinted at violent internal injuries, unexplained bruising, and the presence of peculiar markings, identifiably ritualistic. The blotches of ink across the report whispered of deliberate erasure, of truths deemed too dangerous for public record. The report closed with a note from the coroner himself, urging investigation into occult practices linked to the Eldridge family, a probe that had been abruptly shut down by local authorities. It was clear the town's complicity in silencing Hester's story was part of a larger design to protect something far more terrible than a family scandal. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. One evening, alert to the creaks and sighs of the old house, I sat in the dim light poring over everything I had gathered when a letter slipped silently from between the pages of my great-grandmother's diary. It was an invitation penned in unfamiliar, spidery handwriting. You are summoned to the room that contains the truth. Come alone. The date was today. My breath caught as I realized I had only one place left to search. The locked room that no key could open. The chamber my mother forbade mentioning. Guided by a dread I could neither resist nor explain, I returned to the second floor, heart thudding against my ribs like a frantic prisoner. The outline in the plaster seemed to shimmer in the flickering candlelight where once my hand had pressed. As I ran my fingers along the edges, the key in my palm responded, a faint warmth like a pulse. The lock clicked. The door gave way with a long, eerie groan, revealing a small windowless room lined with rough, hewn timber and the sharp scent of decay. Inside, a solitary wooden chair faced a wall covered in faded scratches, symbols and words scrawled in a frenzy long ago. At the center lay a cradle carved with Eldridge family motifs, empty but drenched in an oppressive silence. On a grimy table rested a mirror veiled with a black cloth. My hands trembling, I pulled back the cloth, and the glass did not reflect me. Instead, I saw her, Hester, her face pale and twisted in an expression that flickered between despair and accusation. No one in the town ever spoke of it again until now. The mirror shattered, and the room was torn open by a cold wind that seemed to howl with the voices of the lost. A voice whispered close to my ear. She warned me never to ask again, but I had already crossed the line. I had glimpsed a nightmare far older than I could have imagined, and the walls of the Eldridge estate contracted around me like a suffocating shroud. At that moment, I understood that Hester was not just a ghost of the past. She was a living shadow haunting the present, a rift in time and memory that threatened to unravel everything I thought was real. The house was not just waiting. It was hungry. The secrets were not buried. They were breathing just beneath the surface. And somewhere deeper still, the true horror waited, patient and eternal. The room felt impossibly cold, the timber walls pressing inward like the ribs of some ancient beast long buried beneath the earth. I stood rooted, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to flee the presence that had coalesced from the fragmented whispers and half-truths I had gathered, now unmistakable as a living horror trapped in a space meant to hold secrets, not souls. The cradle at the center, carved with scenes of the Eldridge family's long lineage, seemed to smear itself into a black void, as if the wood absorbed every story, until nothing but darkness remained. My fingers trembled as I reached toward the mirror, still expecting to see some faint reflection of myself. But instead the glass rippled like water, and there she was, Hester, or some twisted echo of what she used to be. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, but they held no warmth, only a void of despair mingled with fury. Her mouth moved, but no sound came, as if she was screaming silently beneath an invisible weight. Panic flared as the room seemed to constrict. The air thickened and pulsed with a presence that was not purely human. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the wooden chair, the only furniture not swallowed by shadow. Something ancient, something waiting, something hungry grinned beyond the veil, and it whispered the old family curse with a voice that clawed at my sanity. You were never meant to know. The walls shivered, the scribbles on the far side writhing into legible horrors. Offers made, promises broken, blood spilled, souls cursed. And then the violent memory came crashing down. A flood of images and sounds as though the house itself was forcing the truth into me. Hester's last night played out in shattered glimpses. Her frantic footsteps on frost, hardened ground, the howl of a winter wind driven by a malevolent hunger, the hushed chanting of a circle of masked townsfolk, who still paid the ancient price for the Eldridge fortune. I saw my great-grandfather's face hardening in the flicker of torchlight, his voice commanding a ritual both terrible and necessary, and I heard the scream, piercing, agonized, swallowed by snow and silence. The curse they tried to contain was not a mere legend, but a living thing that had chosen Hester as its vessel. She had been marked since birth, or rather branded by something beyond death, an ancestral hunger. Because the Wendigo curse is not a myth, but a slow rot beneath the blood. The house absorbed her flesh and bone. She vanished beneath floorboards, never walked again beneath walls stained not only by time, but by the remnant hunger of the things we pretended never existed. I held my breath as the whisper grew sharper, a warning slipping across the cracked glass. You carry her blood. The weight of that realization crushed me. This was no longer history or myth or tragedy. It was inheritance. The curse was alive in me too. I wanted to scream, to curse the family name that had hidden this horror like a poison beneath its polished veneer. But the room responded. The mirror cracked further, spiderwebbing silence into shards that pricked my skin. Then, in the sudden stillness, a sound stirred behind me. Something scratching, desperate. The door I had closed was no longer solid. It throbbed like a heartbeat too loud in a silent room. I turned, and the dark beyond was no longer the hallway I expected, but a gaping maw dressed in shadow. An abyss that whispered my name with Hester's voice, pleading and threatening all at once. I stepped back toward the cradle, the urge to flee combating an awful compulsion to stay, to face the hungers the family had fed for generations. Then everything fell away. The room dissolved into memory and nightmare, flames licking at the wallpaper, the smell of charred wood smeared with iron. Blood spilled in secret rites beneath the house where the roots twisted like veins deep into the earth. My mother's voice from a long buried time echoed, telling me again and again not to ask, not to pry, not to follow the thread that led here. But I was already too far down the rabbit hole. Images of Hester's face surfaced, less human. Her eyes hollowed by the slow starve of the Wendigo curse. Her laughter a broken thing that ran through the woods at night. Magdalene's words haunted me. Some part of Hester had not just been cursed. She had become the curse. A hunger that no winter chill could ever kill. A shadow stalking the family line in a blight some called madness, others called possession. And now that curse was clawing from within me as surely as it had from her. The bloodline was a chain and I was the newest link. And the house, that grotesque relic of stolen leaves, was breathing around that knowledge like a living thing. My mind reeled. I remembered Samuel's trembling confession, how the town had turned away, covering its eyes as the Eldridge estate descended into something unholy. How the pact of silence was not just about shame, but survival. The price of their prosperity had been paid with bodies and souls, and I was not just an observer anymore. I was implicated, irrevocably bound by lineage and blood. For a moment, the house seemed to pulse in recognition, the shadows bending toward me, as if tasting my fear. I could almost feel it, the cold subterranean breath of the Wendigo's hunger brushing against my skin. Choking, I grabbed the edge of the cradle as the darkness seeped into my bones. But there was more. Something beyond the curse. A deeper betrayal buried beneath generations of lies. The scribbles on the walls revealed it slowly, jagged scars in ink. The family secret was never only about her disappearance, but about what they did to keep her from escaping. Hester's notes, hidden beside the crude carvings, told of an older darkness, a power the family trafficked with, sealing it with blood and bone. She had tried to warn them all, to break the cycle, but was silenced. A single entry chilled me utterly. They call the locked room the heart, because it beats with her pain. They bound her soul in flesh and cedar, to keep the hunger at bay. But they forgot that hunger is infinite. The truth was a virus that spread with every whispered name, with every pact silently renewed beneath that gabled roof. My own flesh trembled with the burden of understanding. This cursed legacy was a plague passed like heirloom jewelry. And then the most harrowing realization struck. The bodily tokens of the curse, the strange marks, the bruises, the wounds the coroner found but could not explain, were not signs of neglect or madness, but marks inflicted by rituals to contain something unspeakable. Brutal attempts to cage an ancient hunger within a fragile human shell. The family was both wardens and victims, willing and unwilling jailers of the nightmare. I staggered, breath shallow, the darkness swirling thick around the edges of my vision. Half inhuman, half deeply broken. The whispered voice returned, rising and falling like the tide, growing urgent. Remember the sacrifice. All at once, the air shifted. Behind me, the cradle creaked as if an unseen weight had settled there. The chair scraped on the floor, a slow, deliberate motion that terrorized the reason I clung to. I dared not look. The house's dreadful secret was no longer confined to the past, no longer safely locked behind ancient oak and plaster. It was alive and reaching. The line between nightmare and memory blurred, and I felt the Wendigo's hunger in my own bones, an annoying emptiness that defied every rational thought I held. And then, just as the shadows stretched inward to swallow the room whole, a brief pause in the relentless unraveling offered a moment of quiet. It is here, in this dark hour of despair and revelation, that I want to pause and say thank you. Thank you from the depths of my being for staying with me this far into this story that is more than just words on a screen. It is a confession, a warning, and a plea. The ghastly journal has been demonetized, and I make nothing from these videos, but hearing your voices, knowing you bear witness to these tales, is the light in this darkness. If you feel moved, there is a link in the description below where you can buy me a coffee to help keep this channel alive. Even the smallest gesture keeps these stories breathing, keeps the candle flame alight on long nights when silence threatens to drown us all. I am humbled by every single one of you, by your courage to listen and to feel. Let us return now to the shadows that wait for no one, where the family's darkest truth is ready to reveal itself in full. With the fragile key still clasped tight in my fingers, the door creaked wider, inviting me into a deeper chamber beneath the house, one forgotten by all but those who had the courage to enter and never leave whole. Descending the narrow stone steps, dampness coated my skin and the air grew heavier, spun thick with the fetid breath of decay and the metallic tang of long, dried blood. At the bottom, a subterranean room stretched farther than light should reach, lit only by flickering candle stubs embedded in sconces corroded with rust. The stone walls were scrolled with symbols that stung the eye, writings in languages long dead, glyphs of binding and banishment. The floor was stained, dark red bleeding into the ancient mortar, pools that whispered when stepped upon. I realized this was the heart of the house's darkness. Shelves held jars filled with unidentifiable things, bones etched with ritual marks, locks of hair, and twisted fragments of cloth bearing strange patterns. Among them lay a grim ledger, its pages brittle but alight with horror. It recorded each generation's sacrifice, each name crossed out in blood, each life exchanged for the town's fragile peace. And there, unmistakably, was Hester's name. This was no mere family secret, but a chronicle of torment, a ledger of souls marked for the insatiable hunger that had consumed her and sought expansion. As I turned the pages, the air shifted, the past bleeding into the present. And in that moment I understood. The curse was cyclical, a slow rot that fed on love and despair, loyalty and betrayal. My own existence was entwined in this web, threading back through mothers and fathers who had been complicit and victims at once. I was the inheritor of a hunger not my own, but inescapably mine to bear. In the depths of that cavernous chamber, I found a final, terrible relic, a locket containing a lock of hair, so pale it seemed almost translucent. Tucked inside was a note written by Hester herself, scrawled in feverish prose. They call me monster, but I see the truth. The hunger is not outside me. It is inside us all, bound by blood, by silence, by the fear too great to name. The sacrifice is eternal. The house is a tomb, not for the dead, but for the broken souls who live in its shadow. My hands shook as the weight of her confession settled like a shroud. The Wendigo cursed us all, but not because we were chosen. It was because we were weak enough to hide the truth, to wear masks of strength and civility while feeding the darkness beneath. I stumbled out of the chamber, the night a suffocating blanket over the Eldridge estate, the house groaning with the burden of secrets that no one had dared tell. And just as the first tendrils of dawn pierced the horizon, I heard it again. The soft dragging sound of nails against wood, muffled sobs. A voice that was not quite living, but refused to be forgotten. Hester's warning lingering still in the cold morning air. The Eldridge family story was not merely tragedy or shame. It was a living nightmare, a shadow cast long enough to engulf us all. The house did not only hold its past, it demanded its continuation. And as I stood on those frost-bitten grounds, the weight of inheritance grounding me, in a terror too profound to name, I knew I had stepped irrevocably beyond the point of no return. What I had uncovered was not a story of death, but a legacy of hunger, silence, and something eternally waiting just out of sight. The true horrors were only beginning. The heavy air of the chamber clung to me like a living shroud, the scent of rot and forgotten prayers pressing against my lungs. The truth, sharp and raw, unfolded with a cruel relentlessness. Hester was no casualty of winter's cold, but a victim of a lineage cursed beyond mercy, sacrificed time and again to quell a hunger older than the town itself. Each word, each scratched symbol on those walls beneath the Eldridge estate, seared into my memory with the clarity of fire on skin. The legacy was a gauntlet thrown down, a chain of blood and silence that stretched across centuries, binding each generation to the same dreadful fate. As I stepped back from the disintegrating pages of the ledger, the flickering candlelight seemed to falter, shadows swelling with the weight of the consumed and the forgotten. The chamber itself pulsed, an ancient heart refusing to cease its beat. The silence that followed was inverted. The absence of sound was a scream in itself, a cavernous void where the last vestiges of innocence had been devoured by ancestral dread. Emerging from the subterranean crypt, the house loomed over me like a sentinel of despair, its windows darkened eyes, watching not only the street, but the very edges of my soul. The dawn's pale light was bitter, cold against the trail of sleepless hours and mounting fear. I knew then that the revelations were not a conclusion, but an induction, a point of no return, sealed in blood. To carry the Eldridge name was to carry the hunger, the Wendigo's insatiable thirst that passed from flesh to flesh, cloaked in whispered myths and veiled rituals. But with understanding came a profound grief. Hester was not merely lost to madness or death. She was the linchpin of a cruel bargain caught between survival and sacrifice. Her story an elegy for all who were bound and buried beneath layers of denial and silence. Returning to the surface world, the fissures in my own identity began to crack wide open. The faces in the family portraits, once painted in stiff formality, now seemed animated with accusation. A silent indictment that the sins of the past were not buried, but still breathing through the bloodline. I caught my reflection briefly in a tarnished mirror, the edges fractured like the family history. My eyes held a frightened recognition, the echo of something monstrous gnawing just beneath the surface. That night, the house did not settle into its usual creaks and sighs, but rather murmured. A soft litany of names lost and forgotten, swirling in the drafts like specters woven of smoke and regret. From the locked room, now unlocked and laid bare, a presence shifted, unseen yet palpable, another pulse in the thickening dark. My mother's earlier warnings reverberated in my mind, urgent commands that no longer felt like mere fear, but desperate attempts at protection. To ask was to awaken something that did not rest peacefully, a beast chained to the blood and bone of the family, forever hungry. Over the following days, the weight of that knowledge settled over me like the thickest fog. Each step I took was measured, guarded, as if I carried a contagion invisible to others, but unmistakably present. The townsfolk of Ashbury Hollow, with their polite nods and averted gazes, remained windows shuttered against the storm of history and horror. It was clear that whatever peace the town claimed was a fragile ruse, propped up by complicit forgetfulness and unspoken pacts. One afternoon, compelled beyond reason, I sought out my mother in the kitchen of the estate. The woman who had once been my stern guardian now appeared diminished, a figure carved from grief and resignation. She looked at me with eyes that knew far more than she had ever confessed. And in her voice, thin and brittle as winter ice, she whispered something I had never heard before, the truth she had been too afraid to share. She told me of the night that changed everything, of a chant beneath the house, of faces cloaked in shadow pledging allegiance to a hunger not born of flesh, but of ancient desperation. She confessed that Hester had become something both victim and vessel, a living prison for the curse, and that her silence was not a shield, but a tomb. Tears traced lines down her worn cheeks, as she begged me to break the cycle, to find a way to free us all from the Wendigo's relentless claim. But that plea came with a weight of dread, a warning that the curse was not a beast to be defeated, but a seed sown deep within us all. Later that night, the house seemed to shift around me, the walls breathing like lungs filled with centuries of sorrow. I wandered the halls, each echo a faint heartbeat of the past, and I understood in a way that chilled me that the Eldridge estate was no longer a home, no longer a sanctuary. It was a mausoleum of broken souls, alive with the restless hunger of what had been sacrificed. I found myself drawn back to the attic, that room swollen with dust and forgotten memories. There on the floor beneath the rotting beams lay scattered remnants of Hester's presence. A threadbare shawl, a cracked locket, and the faded pages of her diary, edges curled like dying leaves. As my fingers traced the words, a sudden chill wrapped around me, and the candle sputtered, casting the room into shadows that writhed and danced. The whisper came again, soft and insistent, threading through the silence like a dark lullaby. Remember, remember, remember. And I shivered despite the warmth of the evening. Days folded into uneasy nights. The legacy of the Eldridge family was no longer mere history, but a living, breathing entity tangled with my very being. I began to feel it during the quiet moments, sharp pangs beneath my ribs, a cold twist in my veins, an annoying emptiness that no food or sleep could fill. My reflection in the mirror grew stranger. Shadows flickered behind my eyes, and a hunger whispered from places I dared not name. I reached out to Magdalene Crowley once more, hoping that the oldest living witness to Ashbury Hollow's secrets might hold some scrap of salvation. In her cluttered cottage, the old woman looked at me, eyes clouded but steady, and said, "You are not alone. The house has claimed many, but some fight the rot better than others." She pressed a small charm into my palm, a twisted symbol carved from bone and etched with runes I did not recognize. She said, "This will dull the hunger, a moment's reprieve, but do not think it a cure. The Wendigo waits patiently for its due." I nodded, clutching the talisman like a lifeline, even as the unrelenting night of my family's curse stretched on beyond the walls of the estate and into the marrow of my bones. The next chapter closed too quickly. One evening, as rain hammered against the mansion's windows, and the air swelled with the scent of wet earth and decay, I felt a desperate urge to confront the unknown once more. Returning to the locked room, heart wild, I found that it was no longer just a physical space, but a threshold between worlds. The broken mirror's shards lay on the rough wooden floor, scattered like tears of glass. And from their fractured gleam, figures flickered, faces twisted with sorrow, hunger, and accusation. I heard Hester's voice again, not as a whisper, but as a rising tide, imploring, accusing, warning. In that moment, the room drew me in, shadows curling around my limbs like curling smoke. A sudden cold pressed against my chest, almost suffocating, and I felt the hunger rise like a tidal wave, ancient and terrible. I stumbled backward, grieving and terrified, but unable to turn away from the dark reflection of my own bloodline. The curse was not a story told at candlelight or whispered in secret. It was alive, fed by memory and flesh alike, and in that infinite hunger, the family, the house, the town, they became nothing but echoes of a past not yet done with the living. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes. An inexplicable coldness in the corners of rooms, shadows that flickered when no light touched them, and the growing dread that the house watched me, waiting for the hunger to claim its next piece.